I pressed my palm against the thick viewport, watching the last traces of surface light fade into absolute darkness. The Acheron's hull creaked and groaned around us, a sound that never got easier to hear no matter how many deep-sea missions I'd run. 23,000 feet down into the Diamantina Trench, and the pressure outside could crush a human body in milliseconds. The mission briefing folder sat open on my lap, though I'd memorized every detail hours ago. Xenocorp's sensors had picked up something unprecedented on the trench floor, an energy signature unlike anything in their databases, stable, powerful, and completely unknown to science. My orders were straightforward: identify the source, contain it if possible, and bring it back to the surface for analysis. Corporate had been very clear about the potential value of whatever was generating that much clean energy. Julian hunched over his collection of ancient star charts, spread across the narrow table behind me, fingers tracing incomprehensible symbols carved into stone tablets he'd insisted on bringing. The guy looked more like he belonged in a university library than a military-grade submersible, but Xenocorp valued his expertise in archaeological anomalies. Right now, he was muttering under his breath about nexus points and lost civilizations that supposedly predated human history by thousands of years. "This configuration matches the Lemurian texts exactly," Julian said, his voice climbing with excitement. "The energy patterns, the geographic location, it's all consistent with the deep-water sanctuaries mentioned in the Forbidden Archives." I kept my eyes on the depth gauge, 21,000 feet and descending. "Julian, we're not here to chase mythology. Xenocorp detected a legitimate energy source, not some fantasy about underwater cities." Sully's hands moved across the control panel with practiced precision, adjusting our descent rate and monitoring the hull integrity readings. The man could pilot anything that floated or flew, and his steady presence at the controls was the only reason I felt comfortable taking the Acheron this deep. His instruments cast blue light across his focused face as he guided us through the crushing darkness. "Dr. Finch, your theories are interesting, but we need to stay focused on the mission parameters," I said, turning to face Julian directly. "Whatever's down there, it's generating enough power to light up half the Pacific Rim. That's what matters to our employers." Julian looked up from his charts, eyes bright with the kind of academic fervor that made me nervous. "But what if it's not just a power source? What if it's something the ancients left behind? The energy readings I've seen match descriptions from texts that scholars considered pure fiction." "Then we document it, secure it, and let the corporate scientists figure out what it means," I replied. "Our job is retrieval, not interpretation." The submersible shuddered slightly as we passed through a thermal layer, and Sully compensated with minute adjustments to our ballast. Outside the viewports, bioluminescent creatures drifted past like alien ghosts, their bodies pulsing with natural light that seemed pathetic compared to the energy signature we were approaching. Julian spread another tablet across his charts, this one covered in spiral symbols that seemed to shift when I looked at them directly. "These markings appear in every ancient culture that had contact with deep ocean waters. Mesopotamian, Egyptian, pre-Columbian. They all describe the same phenomena." "Academic coincidence," I said, though something about those symbols made my skin crawl. Humans have always been fascinated by the ocean depths. Doesn't mean they actually found anything down here. The deeper we descended, the more agitated Julian became. He kept comparing his ancient texts to the mission data, pointing out correlations that meant nothing to me, but clearly excited him. His theories about lost civilizations and forgotten technologies belonged in research papers, not on a corporate extraction mission. Sully's voice cut through Julian's excited rambling. 22,000 feet. Hull pressure is within normal parameters, but I'm starting to pick up some unusual readings on the long-range sensors. I moved to look over his shoulder at the instrument panel. The sonar display showed mostly empty water beneath us, but there were strange echoes coming from somewhere near the trench floor. What kind of unusual? Hard to say. The water density seems different down there, and I'm getting interference on several frequencies. Sully frowned at his screens, making small adjustments to the sensor array. Could be thermal vents or mineral deposits affecting the readings. Julian practically pressed his face against his own viewport, trying to peer through the darkness. The text mentioned that the ancient sites were always located at points where the Earth's energy converged. If this is really one of those places... It's a geothermal anomaly, I interrupted. Nothing more mystical than that. But even as I said it, something felt wrong about the water around us. The Acheron's lights seemed dimmer than they should be, as if the darkness itself was swallowing the illumination. The usual sea life that inhabited these depths was noticeably absent, leaving us alone in an empty void that stretched beyond our sensors. 23,000 feet. We were approaching the bottom of the Diamantina Trench, one of the deepest points in the Pacific Ocean. The pressure outside was enough to flatten steel, yet something down here was generating enough energy to register on satellite readings from orbit. Sully's instruments began chirping with increasing frequency. He leaned forward, adjusting controls and checking readings twice before speaking. I'm picking up something massive ahead of us. Range is about 200 meters and closing. I moved to the main viewport, straining to see through the absolute darkness. Our lights could only penetrate about 50 meters in water this dense, but the sonar was painting a picture that made no sense. How massive are we talking? I asked. Sully's voice was carefully controlled, the tone of a professional trying to process impossible data. Based on the sonar return, I'd estimate it's roughly the size of a city block. Maybe larger. It's sitting directly on the trench floor, and the geometry... He paused, double-checking his readings. The geometry is completely artificial. Straight lines, perfect angles. This is definitely not a natural formation. Julian looked up from his tablets, face pale in the instrument light. That's exactly what the texts describe. Massive structures built by the precursor civilization, waiting in the deep places of the Earth. My training kicked in, pushing aside the growing unease in my gut. Whatever we'd found down here, it was clearly the source of the energy signature. My job was to assess the situation and determine how to proceed with the mission. The Acheron's lights began to reveal something ahead of us in the water, a dark mass that seemed to absorb our illumination rather than reflect it. As we drew closer, I could make out edges and surfaces that definitely weren't natural. The structure sat on the ocean floor like it had been waiting for us, geometric and wrong in ways that hurt to look at directly. Sully brought us to a hover about 50 meters from the anomaly, close enough to see but far enough to maintain safety distance. The sonar painted a detailed picture of something that shouldn't exist. A massive structure with clean lines and impossible angles, sitting in one of the most remote places on Earth. The floodlights cut through the water ahead of us, and what they revealed made my breath catch in my throat. The structure wasn't just artificial. It was impossible. Metallic surfaces curved into organic shapes that my eyes couldn't quite follow, creating a building that seemed to exist in more dimensions than it should. Looking directly at it made my head hurt, like trying to focus on an optical illusion that kept shifting when I wasn't paying attention. Sully, are you getting readings on this thing? I asked, pressing closer to the viewport. His hands moved across the instrument panel, but his frown deepened with every adjustment he made. The sensors are completely scrambled. Sonar waves aren't bouncing back the way they should. It's like the structure is absorbing them instead of reflecting them. Same thing with our electromagnetic scans. The hull groaned around us as Sully maneuvered the Acheron closer, bringing us within 30 meters of what had to be the most significant archaeological discovery in human history. The structure's surface seemed to bend our floodlights around itself, creating shadows that fell in directions that made no geometric sense. Julian pressed his face against his viewport, and when he looked back at us, his skin had gone completely white. Those symbols carved into the hull, I recognized them. I turned to look where he was pointing. Etched deep into the structure's surface were spiraling glyphs that seemed to writhe in the shifting light from our floods. They were identical to the markings I'd seen on Julian's stone tablets, the ones he'd been studying since we started our descent. "They're the same symbols from the Forbidden Archives," Julian whispered, his voice barely audible over the submersible's ambient noise. "The texts that described the deep-water sanctuaries of the precursor civilization. This is exactly what they documented." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the water temperature outside. Those tablets Julian had brought weren't just academic curiosities. They were a map. And we'd followed it straight to whatever the ancients had left behind in the deepest part of the ocean. "We need to find a way inside," I said, pushing aside the implications of Julian's discovery. My mission parameters were clear: identify the energy source and secure it for Xenocorp. Whatever this structure was, it was generating enough power to light up half the Pacific, and that made it worth investigating, regardless of its historical significance. Sully guided us along the structure's perimeter, searching for any kind of opening or access point. The building, if that's what it was, stretched much further than our lights could penetrate, disappearing into the darkness on all sides. The sonar readings suggested it was roughly rectangular, but the angles were wrong in ways that made my eyes water when I tried to track them. "There," Julian called out, pointing toward what might have been the structure's base. "That circular section. It's different from the rest." I could see what he meant. Set into the structure's wall was a massive round portal, easily large enough for our submersible to pass through. Unlike the rest of the building's impossible geometry, this feature looked functional, with clearly defined edges and what appeared to be some kind of sealing mechanism around its circumference. "It's an iris," Sully said, studying the formation through his instruments. "A mechanical aperture, but it's completely sealed. The material looks like the same stuff as the rest of the structure, some kind of metal organic composite I've never seen before." I made my decision. "Take us in closer. We're going to open it." Sully maneuvered the Acheron until we were positioned directly in front of the portal, close enough that our drilling arms could reach the surrounding material. The iris itself looked impenetrable, but the wall around it showed signs of being less densely constructed. "Beginning excavation," Sully announced, extending the submersible's mining equipment. The diamond-tipped drilling arms made contact with the structure's surface, and I expected them to either bounce off or take hours to make any progress. Instead, the material gave way immediately, crumbling like it had been waiting for us to find this exact spot. Within minutes, Sully had cleared away enough debris to expose the full circumference of the portal. The moment the last section of surrounding material fell away, the iris began to open. It moved with fluid precision, segments retracting into the wall to reveal a passage beyond. But what lay on the other side made no sense at all. Instead of empty space or flooded corridors, the opening was filled with liquid that glowed with soft bioluminescent light. The substance looked thicker than seawater, more viscous, and it didn't seem to be mixing with the ocean around us. "That's not water," Sully said, checking his readings twice before speaking. "It's some kind of oxygenated fluid. The chemical composition is, well, it's nothing I've ever seen, but according to these scans, it should be breathable for humans." Julian leaned closer to his viewport, studying the glowing passage. The texts mentioned that the ancient sites were filled with life-sustaining atmosphere that could support both aquatic and terrestrial beings. This has to be it. Some kind of synthetic environment that's been maintained for thousands of years. I stared at the opening, weighing our options. My orders were to investigate the energy source, and this portal clearly led deeper into the structure. But sending a team inside meant leaving our escape route behind and trusting alien technology that had been sitting on the ocean floor since before recorded history. Sully, anchor us to the structure. We're going in. He nodded and extended the Acheron's magnetic clamps, securing us to the temple's exterior hull. The mechanical arms locked into place with solid thunks that reverberated through our cabin, creating a connection between our submersible and whatever waited inside the portal. While Sully prepared the anchoring system, Julian and I moved to the equipment bay to suit up in our EVA gear. The environmental suits were designed for underwater operations, but they'd also function in the alien atmosphere beyond the portal. Each suit included 6 hours of emergency oxygen, communications equipment, and basic tool packages for sample collection. Julian's hands shook as he pulled on his helmet, excitement and terror warring across his face. We're about to enter a structure built by a civilization that disappeared before humans developed agriculture. Do you understand what this means? I sealed my own helmet and ran through the suit systems check. It means we're about to investigate the most valuable energy source in human history. Everything else is secondary. But even as I said it, I knew this mission had moved far beyond simple corporate objectives. The portal waiting ahead of us led into something that challenged everything we thought we knew about Earth's history. And Julian's research suggested we were walking into the remnants of a technology far more advanced than our own. 20 minutes later, we were swimming through corridors that shouldn't exist. The liquid atmosphere was warm against our suits, thick enough to provide buoyancy but not so dense that movement became difficult. Bioluminescent veins ran along the walls like circulatory systems, pulsing with soft light that illuminated passages stretching further than our helmet lamps could penetrate. Julian moved ahead of me, following symbols carved into the wall that seemed to indicate direction or purpose. His breathing came in excited gasps over the comm system as he recognized more and more elements from his ancient texts. Behind us, the iris portal remained open, and through it I could see the Acheron's lights, where Sully waited to monitor our progress. Our communication link with the submersible was still active, providing a lifeline back to the world we knew. But with every meter we swam deeper into the alien structure, that world felt further and further away. My boots touched solid ground for the first time since we'd entered the portal, and the sensation caught me completely off guard. The liquid atmosphere still surrounded us, but gravity had somehow reasserted itself in a way that made no scientific sense. I should have been floating or struggling against buoyancy, but instead I walked normally across what felt like a stable floor. Julian moved ahead of me with growing confidence, his helmet lamp cutting through the thick, glowing fluid as he traced symbols carved into the corridor walls. The bioluminescent conduits pulsed with rhythmic energy, creating a network of light that disappeared into passages branching off in every direction. The whole structure felt alive, like we were moving through the circulatory system of some massive organism. The gravitational field is being artificially generated, Julian said over the comm, his voice tight with excitement. This technology is thousands of years ahead of anything we've developed. I kept one hand on my sidearm as we moved deeper into the maze. The passages curved upward in ways that hurt my head to follow, creating impossible geometry that reminded me why looking directly at the structure's exterior had been so disorienting. Whatever beings had built this place, they understood physics in ways that human science hadn't even begun to explore.
The architecture around us was clearly designed for creatures much larger than humans. Doorways rose 20 feet high, and the chambers we passed through stretched beyond the reach of our lights. Spiral ramps connected different levels in configurations that made me dizzy, and more than once I had to stop and reorient myself when a corridor seemed to loop back on itself.
Julian paused at every intersection, studying the carved symbols that covered every available surface. The glyphs seemed to shift when I looked at them peripherally, creating an optical effect that made my eyes water. But Julian read them like a roadmap, guiding us through the maze with increasing certainty. These markings indicate direction and purpose, he explained as we passed through another vast chamber. The central symbols are pointing towards something significant, probably the structure's power source. The energy conduits grew brighter and more numerous as we progressed deeper into the temple. What had started as occasional veins of light became a dense network that pulsed with synchronized rhythm. The liquid atmosphere carried their emanations, creating shifting patterns of illumination that reminded me of aurora displays. We'd been exploring for nearly an hour when Julian stopped at the entrance to what was clearly the structure's heart. The passage ahead opened into a chamber so vast that our lights couldn't find the far walls. Energy conduits converged from every direction, feeding into something that cast its own brilliant glow through the liquid atmosphere. "This is it," Julian whispered, his breathing rapid with anticipation. "The central core chamber." I followed him through the entrance, and what I saw made me stop in my tracks. A massive crystalline formation hung suspended in the center of the room, easily 50 feet in diameter and pulsing with internal light. The crystal was perfectly spherical, rotating slowly on its axis, while energy arcs danced across its surface like trapped lightning. Alien machinery surrounded the core in concentric rings, each level covered in the same spiral glyphs we'd been following. Control panels and interface stations were built into platforms that could be accessed by ramps spiraling up from the chamber floor. Everything was sized for beings much taller than humans, but the basic layout was recognizable. This was clearly some kind of command center. Julian moved toward the nearest control panel like he was being pulled by invisible strings. His helmet light played across symbols that seemed more complex and densely packed than anything we'd encountered in the corridors. The interface itself was a smooth, seamless surface that reflected our lights with mirror-like precision. "Julian, don't touch anything," I called out, but he was already climbing the ramp toward the panel. "We need to study this first, understand what we're dealing with." He looked back at me with the expression I'd learned to dread, the look of an academic who'd found something that validated years of theoretical work. "These symbols match the deepest layer of the forbidden archives. I know what they mean." The crystalline core pulsed brighter as he approached the control panel, as if responding to his presence. Energy patterns shifted across its surface, creating configurations that seemed to follow his movement. Whatever this machine was, it was aware of our intrusion. "Dr. Finch, step away from that interface," I ordered, moving toward the ramp myself. "We're here to gather intelligence, not experiment with alien technology." But Julian was already placing his hands on the smooth surface. His fingers spread wide across symbols that began to glow at his touch. His academic excitement had completely overridden any sense of caution, and I could see the moment when he made contact with whatever intelligence controlled this place. The change was instantaneous and overwhelming. A deafening harmonic vibration filled the chamber, so deep and powerful that I felt it in my bones despite the liquid atmosphere around us. The crystalline core blazed with blinding light that turned the entire chamber into a kaleidoscope of energy patterns. I threw my hands up to shield my helmet visor, but the light seemed to penetrate everything. Behind us, the iris portal slammed shut with a sound like thunder, cutting off our connection to the Acheron. and trapping us inside the alien structure. The harmonic vibration continued, building in intensity, until I thought my eardrums might burst. Julian stumbled backward from the control panel, his face white with shock behind his helmet visor. The symbols under his hands continued to glow for several seconds, before gradually fading back to their normal luminescence. But the real change was happening in the chamber floor beneath our feet. A massive glyph had appeared in the smooth surface, easily 30 feet across and perfectly circular. Energy was beginning to fill the intricate pattern from its outer edge, moving inward with steady, measured progress like liquid light flowing through carved channels. The glyph pulsed with the same rhythm as the crystalline core above us, and I didn't need Julian's expertise to understand what I was looking at. This was a countdown of some kind, and whatever we just activated was building towards something that would happen when that pattern finished filling with energy. The crystalline core's pulsing grew more frantic, and that's when I noticed the chamber walls starting to change. What had looked like solid metal surfaces began to ripple and flow like liquid, the material undulating in waves that made my stomach lurch. The bioluminescent conduits flared brighter, casting wild shadows as something moved beneath the temple's skin. I grabbed Julian's arm and yanked him back from the control panel just as the first one pushed through the wall. The thing that emerged wasn't anything evolution had ever produced. 8 feet of sleek metal and glistening organic tissue moved with mechanical precision, its body a seamless fusion of technologies I couldn't begin to understand. Multiple arms extended from its central torso, each one ending in what looked like surgical instruments that hummed with contained energy. The surfaces where metal met flesh showed no seams or joints. Everything flowed together like it had been grown, rather than built. "What the hell is that?" Julian whispered, his voice cracking through the calm. The machine turned toward us with fluid grace, and I found myself looking into sensors that might have been eyes if they'd belonged to something living. Its head tilted with clinical interest, studying us like specimens that had wandered into a laboratory. When it moved closer, I could see that its feet ended in razor-sharp points that found perfect purchase on the chamber floor. I drew my sidearm and put 3 rounds center mass before the thing had taken another step. The projectile sparked off its armored hide and ricocheted into the liquid atmosphere around us, leaving barely visible scratches on surfaces that should have been torn apart by high-velocity impacts. The machine didn't even pause. It continued its approach with the same measured pace, one of its arms extending toward Julian, while energy began to build along the length of its surgical appendage. The limb ended in something between a scalpel and a welding torch, crackling with power that would slice through our environmental suits like paper. That's when the walls erupted. More of the machines pushed through surfaces that parted like water, each one identical to the first in size and configuration but moving with perfect coordination. They emerged from the floor, the ceiling, every available surface until I counted at least 6 of the things surrounding us in a loose circle. Julian screamed as the nearest machine reached for him with movements that reminded me of a surgeon preparing to make the first incision. Its energy scalpel hummed louder as it approached his helmet, probably calculating the most efficient way to open his suit and examine whatever was inside. I pulled the pin on one of my charges and lobbed it at the machine's feet. The explosion sent it tumbling backward in a shower of sparks and organic fluid, but when the smoke cleared, the thing was already getting back up. Damage to its left arm had exposed internal workings that looked more like circulatory systems than mechanical components, but it showed no signs of pain or hesitation. The other machines didn't react to their companion's injury. No anger, no urgency, just the same clinical assessment as they continued their approach. Whatever these things were, they operated on pure logic rather than emotion. We were contamination that needed to be sterilized. Nothing more. "Kay, we need to move," Julian said, backing away from the closest machine as its scalpel arm swept through the space where his head had been moments before. I grabbed his shoulder and pulled him toward what looked like another passage leading out of the chamber. The wounded machine had rejoined the group, its damaged arms still functional despite the obvious trauma. They moved as a unit, maintaining their circle formation while herding us toward whatever exit they preferred. Behind us, Sully's voice crackled through the comm system with increasing distortion. "Kay, something's happening out here. The temple's energy output just tripled, and the water temperature around the structure is climbing fast. Whatever you did in there, it's affecting the entire ocean floor." I kept my weapon trained on the nearest machine while backing toward the passage opening. The countdown glyph in the chamber floor was filling faster now, its energy patterns pulsing in sync with the crystalline core above us. Whatever Julian had activated was building toward something catastrophic, and these machines were just the first line of defense. The passage ahead disappeared into darkness beyond our helmet lamps, but it was our only option. The machines continued their methodical advance, energy scalpels raised and ready to begin their work the moment we stopped moving. I fired another burst at the closest one, aiming for the sensors clustered around what might have been its head. The shots connected but only seemed to annoy the thing, causing it to adjust its approach vector slightly while continuing its relentless pursuit. "Whatever these things are, they're not going to let us leave," I told Julian as we reached the passage entrance. The machines paused at the chamber's edge, their sensors tracking our movement while they seemed to calculate the most efficient pursuit pattern. For a moment, I thought they might let us go, but then they began moving again with the same surgical precision. We turned and ran into the darkness of the temple's corridors, leaving the pulsing countdown and its mechanical guardians behind us. But I could hear them following, their pointed feet clicking against the floor with the rhythm of a timer counting down to something terrible. My lungs burned as I pressed my back against what I hoped was a solid wall, listening for the telltale clicking of warden feet on metal floors. Julian crouched beside me, his helmet lamp dimmed to barely a glow as we waited in the thick, luminescent atmosphere that filled this section of the temple. We'd been running for 30 minutes now, and I was starting to realize that escape might be impossible. The corridors kept changing around us. Not dramatically. I wasn't watching walls literally move, but passages that had been there when we'd first fled the central chamber simply weren't there anymore when we tried to retrace our steps. Intersections led to dead ends that hadn't existed before. Ramps spiraled up to levels that shouldn't have been accessible from where we started. Julian was right about one thing. This place was alive, and it was learning. "They're getting closer," Julian whispered, pointing down the corridor we'd just escaped through. "I can hear them." He was right. The rhythmic clicking of metal feet against floor panels echoed from somewhere behind us, methodical and patient. The wardens didn't need to rush. They knew we were trapped in here with them, and they had all the time in the world to hunt us down properly. I checked my weapon's ammunition counter and felt my stomach drop. 2 magazines left, maybe 60 rounds total. Each warden I'd managed to disable had cost me at least a full magazine of concentrated fire on their joints and sensor clusters. At this rate, I'd be down to harsh language and thrown rocks within the hour. "We need to find another control panel," I told Julian, scanning the walls around us for any sign of the spiral glyphs that marked interface stations. "Figure out what you triggered back there and how to shut it down." Julian nodded and pulled out one of his tablets, comparing the symbols carved into the corridor walls with his ancient reference materials. His hands shook as he traced the markings with his finger, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead behind his helmet visor. "These passages are showing directional markers," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "But they're not leading toward any kind of exit. They're all pointing deeper into the structure, towards something called the Deep Archive." The clicking behind us grew louder, echoing through the liquid atmosphere in ways that made it impossible to determine exactly how close our pursuers were. I grabbed Julian's shoulder and pulled him away from the wall, leading him down a passage that curved upward in a spiral that hurt my eyes to follow directly. We climbed for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the artificial gravity keeping our feet planted on surfaces that should have been ceiling or walls, depending on your perspective. The bioluminescent conduits grew brighter as we ascended, their pulsing energy creating patterns that seemed to respond to our movement through the corridors. Julian stopped suddenly at what looked like another interface panel, this one built into a wall covered with symbols more complex than anything we'd encountered so far. The glyphs were layered in concentric circles around a central depression that was clearly designed for hands much larger than human ones. "I have to try," Julian said, approaching the panel with the desperate determination of someone who knew he'd caused an unimaginable disaster. "Maybe I can understand what I activated." He placed his hands on the smooth surface, his fingers spread wide across symbols that immediately began to glow at his touch. The reaction was less dramatic than what had happened in the central chamber, but I could see energy flowing through the carved patterns as the temple's intelligence assessed his request for information. Julian's eyes went wide behind his visor, and when he looked back at me, his face had gone completely white. "It's not a power source," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the comm system. "It was never a power source." The glyph panel continued to pulse with energy as more information flowed through the connection Julian had established. His breathing became rapid and shallow as he read symbols that revealed truths no human was supposed to know. "What is it then?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to hear the answer. "A terraforming engine," Julian said, his voice cracking with horror. "A world seed. It's designed to remake planetary atmospheres, to transform entire worlds into something suitable for whoever built this place." The implications hit me like a physical blow. Xenocorp hadn't sent us to retrieve an energy source. They'd unknowingly dispatched us to activate a doomsday weapon that would remake Earth's entire biosphere. Every corporate briefing document, every mission parameter, every assurance about containing and studying a revolutionary power source, all of it was based on fundamentally wrong assumptions about what we were dealing with. Julian pulled his hands away from the panel, but the damage was already done. More information had flowed through the connection, and I could see in his expression that each new revelation was worse than the last. "The countdown isn't measuring time until an explosion," he continued, his voice getting higher with each word. "It's counting down to activation of a process that will flash boil Earth's oceans and create a new atmosphere. The energy signature Xenocorp detected wasn't power generation. It was the temple warming up, drawing energy from the planet's core to fuel the transformation." I tried to contact Sully through the comm system, but all I got was static punctuated by fragments of garbled transmission. What little I could make out wasn't encouraging. Something about rising water temperatures and massive energy discharges from the temple's exterior hull. The structure was already beginning its work. Julian moved to another section of the panel, his academic training overriding his fear as he worked to extract more information from the alien interface. The symbols under his hands pulsed faster, feeding him data about processes that should never have been unleashed on our world. "According to these readings, the temple is drawing power directly from tectonic activity," he said, his voice hollow with growing despair. "It's tapping into magma chambers, using the planet's own core energy to fuel the atmospheric conversion. The process will generate temperatures hot enough to vaporize seawater across entire continental shelves." Behind us, the clicking of warden feet echoed through the corridors, getting closer with each passing moment. They'd found our trail again, and this time they seemed to be moving faster, as if the temple was directing them toward our location with increasing urgency. I grabbed Julian's arm and pulled him away from the interface panel. "We need to move. Figure out the rest of this while we're running." he stumbled as I dragged him toward another passage, his attention still focused on the tablet where he was trying to translate the information he'd extracted from the temple systems. The revelations were coming faster now, each one more terrifying than the last. "The atmosphere they're creating," Julian said as we moved through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. "It's not just different from ours. It's actively toxic to carbon-based life. The temperature and chemical composition will sterilize the entire surface of the planet before the new ecosystem takes hold." We reached another intersection, and I had to make a split-second decision about which direction offered the best chance of avoiding our pursuers. The passages all looked identical, filled with the same glowing liquid atmosphere and marked with symbols I couldn't read. I chose the route that sloped downward, hoping it might lead us back toward the temple's exterior levels. The clicking behind us grew louder, accompanied now by the hum of energy weapons charging for firing. The wardens had definitely picked up our trail, and they were moving with the mechanical precision of hunters who'd located their prey. Julian worked frantically at his tablet as we moved, cross-referencing the temple's data with his ancient archives to piece together a complete picture of what we'd stumbled into. Each new translation made his breathing more rapid and his movements more erratic. "The beings who built this place," he said, his voice breaking with barely controlled panic. "They weren't from Earth. This whole structure is a colonial tool, designed to prepare worlds for settlement by transforming them into suitable habitats. They've done this before, probably hundreds of times across the galaxy." I turned a corner and nearly ran directly into another warden. The machine stood at the center of a circular chamber, its multiple arms extended and energy scalpels humming with lethal power. It turned toward us with fluid grace, sensors focusing on our environmental suits with the clinical interest of a surgeon examining patients before an operation. I opened fire before it could take another step, concentrating my shots on the joints connecting its arms to its central torso. The high-velocity rounds sparked off its armored hide, but sustained fire on the same target points eventually began to show results. Organic fluid leaked from damaged connections, and one of its surgical appendages went dead as I severed the control linkages. The warden adapted immediately, redistributing its weight and switching to its remaining functional arms. It moved toward us with the same measured pace, seemingly unbothered by the damage I'd inflicted. Behind its position, I could see at least 2 more machines emerging from passages on the far side of the chamber. I lobbed my last explosive charge at the damaged warden's feet and grabbed Julian, pulling him toward what looked like the only exit that wasn't blocked by approaching machines. The blast sent the first warden tumbling backward in a shower of sparks and organic debris, but the other 2 continued their advance without pause. Julian looked up from his tablet as we reached the chamber's exit, his face white with absolute horror behind his helmet visor. "According to my calculations," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "we have less than 4 hours before the terraforming process becomes irreversible." The truth hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I stared at Julian's pale face behind his helmet visor, watching him frantically work through the calculations on his tablet. The numbers didn't lie. Xenocorp hadn't sent us down here to retrieve some new energy source for their corporate empire. They'd sent us to activate a doomsday weapon. "This can't be right," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were. The mission briefing had been too vague, too focused on energy signatures without any real explanation of what we might find. Corporate greed had blinded them to the possibility that some things were better left undisturbed. Julian looked up from his tablet, his eyes wide with horror. The energy readings Xenocorp detected weren't from a power source waiting to be harvested. They were from a machine that's been dormant for thousands of years, waiting for someone stupid enough to wake it up. My stomach twisted as the full scope of our situation became clear. Every person on Earth was going to pay the price for our ignorance, for Julian's academic curiosity, for my willingness to follow corporate orders without asking the right questions. The comm system crackled with static, and then Sully's voice broke through the interference. His words came in fragments at first, distorted by the temple's increasing energy output. "Kay, can you hear me? The readings up here are going crazy. Thermal vents are opening all across the ocean floor. I'm seeing massive temperature spikes spreading outward from your position." I grabbed the comm unit. "Sully, how bad is it?" "Bad. Really bad. I'm picking up satellite data showing atmospheric disturbances starting over the Pacific. Whatever you guys triggered down there, it's already beginning to work." Julian's hands shook as he continued scrolling through data on his tablet. The terraforming process has multiple phases. First, it destabilizes the ocean floor to access geothermal energy. Then it begins atmospheric conversion. We're seeing phase 1 right now. The clicking of warden feet echoed from the corridors behind us, growing closer. I checked my weapons ammunition counter again. 1 magazine left, plus 2 explosive charges. Not nearly enough to fight our way out of this place, even if there was somewhere to go. "Sully, what about the Iris portal? Can you break through from the outside?" Static filled the comm for several seconds before his voice returned. "Negative. The portal sealed itself completely after you went through. The Acheron's mining equipment can't even scratch the surface. Whatever that thing is made of, it's tougher than anything we've got." Julian looked up from his tablet, his face grim. The portal was designed to prevent contamination from escaping once the process begins. We can't leave, and no one can get in to help us. I felt the walls of the temple closing in around us, both literally and figuratively. The wardens were hunting us through the corridors. The terraforming countdown was accelerating, and we were trapped inside an alien machine designed to remake our entire planet. "There has to be something we can do," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. Julian's fingers moved frantically across his tablet screen. "Maybe. The temple needs massive amounts of energy to complete the atmospheric conversion. If we could disrupt its power source." "The crystalline core," I said, remembering the pulsing formation in the central chamber. "Exactly. But the temple's containment field protects it from external damage. We'd need to disable the field first, then find a way to overload the core itself." Sully's voice crackled through the comm again. "I might have an idea about that. The Acheron's reactor isn't just for propulsion. It's an experimental quantum fusion design that Xenocorp wanted field tested. If I could get close enough to the core, I could overload the containment matrix and create a chain reaction." I understood what he was suggesting, and my blood ran cold. That would destroy the submersible and anyone inside it. "Yeah, well, that's better than letting this thing turn Earth into an alien greenhouse. But I'd need to position the Acheron directly beneath the core, and someone would have to disable the containment field at exactly the right moment." Julian looked up from his tablet. "The glyph sequence. I've been studying the symbols around the core chamber. There's a shutdown protocol built into the system, but it requires precise timing. If I can solve the final sequence and input it at the moment, Sully begins the overload." The plan was insane. A suicide mission with no guarantee of success. But as another wave of clicking echoed through the corridors, and the temple's energy output continued to climb, I realized we didn't have any other choice. "How long do we have?" I asked. Julian checked his calculations one more time. "Based on the current rate of energy buildup, maybe 3 hours before the atmospheric conversion becomes irreversible. After that, even destroying the core won't stop the process." 3 hours to fight our way back through a temple full of wardens, disable an alien containment field, and sacrifice our only means of escape. The odds were beyond terrible, but the alternative was the extinction of all life on Earth. The 2 hours it took us to fight our way back felt like a lifetime. Every corridor we entered seemed designed to kill us in a new and creative way. The temple had woken up completely now, and it wasn't holding back. The first gravity well nearly crushed Julian flat against the floor. I grabbed his arm and hauled him sideways just as the field intensified, leaving a crater where he'd been standing. My boots felt like they weighed 100 pounds each as we stumbled out of range. "This way," Julian gasped, pointing at symbols that glowed faintly along the wall. "The glyphs are showing safe passages." I didn't argue. His knowledge of the ancient writing was the only thing keeping us alive. We ducked through a narrow opening just as energy fields erupted behind us, hot enough to melt the metal walls. The heat burned through my protective suit in seconds, leaving angry red welts across my back. The wardens came at us in waves. 3 would attack from the front while 2 more flanked us from side passages. I used my remaining charges strategically, collapsing corridors behind us to slow them down. My ammunition counter showed 8 rounds left, then 6, then 3. "There's another route," Julian said, studying his tablet while we pressed against a wall. Warden footsteps echoed from both directions. "The maintenance shafts run parallel to the main corridors." We crawled through spaces barely wide enough for our shoulders. The walls tried to compress us twice, grinding inward with mechanical precision. I fired my last 3 rounds into the control mechanisms, buying us enough time to squeeze through before the passages sealed shut. Julian's predictions weren't perfect. We hit 2 dead ends and had to backtrack while the temple's defenses adapted to our movements. Energy beams tracked us through the corridors, forcing us to zigzag and dive for cover. One blast caught my helmet, cracking the visor and filling my suit with the temple's thick atmosphere. The breathing fluid tasted metallic and wrong, but it kept me conscious. Julian helped me seal the crack with emergency tape while warden voices echoed closer. "The central chamber's just ahead," he said, checking his tablet one more time. "But they're going to throw everything at us once we're in the open." He was right. The moment we stepped into the vast space, every surface erupted with wardens. They poured from the walls like water, their energy scalpels humming with lethal intent. I counted at least 20 of them forming a loose circle around the crystalline core. But Sully was there. The Acheron hovered directly beneath the massive crystal, its hull blackened and scarred from the temple's increasing energy output. Burn marks covered the submersible's surface, and I could see stress fractures running along the viewport, but the engines were still running. "About time you 2 showed up," Sully's voice crackled through the comm. "This place is trying to cook me alive down here." The countdown glyph on the chamber floor was 3/4 filled now, pulsing faster with each passing second. The energy made my teeth ache and my vision blur around the edges. Whatever this thing was building toward, we were running out of time to stop it. Julian sprinted toward the control panel surrounding the core while I positioned myself between him and the advancing wardens. They moved with that same relentless precision, no fear or hesitation in their mechanical minds. Just the absolute certainty that we were contamination that needed to be eliminated. I pulled the pin on my second-to-last charge and rolled it toward the nearest group. The explosion sent 3 of them tumbling backward, but they were already getting back up. These things didn't stay down. "Sully, how long do you need?" I shouted into the comm while drawing my sidearm. "Give me 5 minutes to destabilize the containment field," he replied. "Then we'll see if this crazy plan actually works." 5 minutes. I had 1 explosive charge left, and maybe 24 rounds. The wardens were closing in from every direction, their energy scalpels raised and ready to complete their ancient purpose. The chamber erupted into absolute chaos. Energy blasts from the unstable crystalline core lit up the space like lightning strikes, each discharge hot enough to turn metal into vapor. I squeezed off 3 rounds at the nearest warden, watching sparks fly off its armored hide as it kept advancing. Behind me, Sully's fingers flew across the reactor controls while Julian worked frantically at the glyph interface. "How much longer?" I shouted over the noise of crackling energy and grinding metal. "Almost there," Julian called back, sweat beading on his forehead behind his cracked visor. "The sequence is responding, but I need another minute." I didn't think we had another minute. The wardens kept coming, pouring out of openings in the walls like they had an endless supply. I pulled the pin on my second-to-last charge and hurled it at a cluster of 3 machines. The explosion sent them tumbling backward, but 2 more immediately took their place. The core above us pulsed brighter, and suddenly a massive energy discharge erupted from its center. The blast struck the Acheron's cockpit dead on, and I heard Sully scream. Superheated metal fragments sprayed through the air like shrapnel. When the light faded, I could see him slumped over his console, dark stains spreading across his chest and abdomen. "Sully." I started toward him, but he waved me back with one bloody hand. "Stay there," he gasped, blood frothing at the corners of his mouth. "Keep them off Julian. I can still do this." His hands shook as he reached for the reactor controls again, leaving red smears on the interface. I could see the damage was bad, really bad. But he kept working with the kind of desperate precision that comes from knowing you're running out of time. Another energy blast from the core melted a section of the chamber wall just meters from where I stood. The heat was incredible, even through my suit. I fired my remaining rounds at 2 wardens flanking us from the left, managing to damage one enough that it stumbled and fell behind. "Got it!" Julian suddenly yelled. "The containment field is destabilizing." The massive crystal above us began to flicker and pulse erratically. The steady hum that had filled the chamber since we arrived turned into an angry whine that made my teeth ache. Cracks of brilliant light started racing across the core's surface. Sully looked up from his console, his face pale and slick with sweat. Blood ran down his chin as he tried to speak. 90 seconds. He managed to get out. Maybe less. Get to the escape pod in the bay. What about you? He shook his head weakly. Someone has to keep the reactor stable until it goes critical. If the timing's off, the chain reaction won't be strong enough to destroy the temple's power source. I grabbed Julian's arm and started pulling him toward the rear of the submersible. "Come on, we have to go." "Wait," Julian protested, still staring at his tablet. "I need to make sure the shutdown sequence completes properly." "The sequence is done," I snapped. "Sully's handling the rest." Behind us, more wardens emerged from the walls, at least 6 of them this time, their energy scalpels already humming with deadly power. They moved with that same relentless precision, spreading out to cut off our escape routes. I used my last explosive charge, throwing it right into the middle of their formation. The blast knocked 3 of them down, but the others kept coming. The chamber shook violently as another energy discharge from the core struck the far wall, turning a section of ancient metal into molten slag. 70 seconds, Sully called out, his voice getting weaker. His hands never stopped moving across the controls, even as more blood pooled beneath him. I shoved Julian toward the submersible's rear bay, where I could see the emergency escape pod mounted in its launch tube. The pod was barely big enough for 1 person, designed for exactly this kind of situation. Julian stumbled ahead of me, finally understanding the urgency. The wardens were closing in fast, their pointed feet clicking against the chamber floor in perfect synchronization. Energy scalpels raised and ready to complete whatever sterilization protocol they'd been programmed to follow. I grabbed Julian's arm and yanked him toward the rear of the Acheron. The submersible bucked and groaned around us as another energy discharge from the crystalline core sent sparks cascading across the chamber walls. Behind us, the wardens were regrouping, their metallic feet clicking against the temple floor in perfect synchronization. "We have to go now," I shouted over the chaos, pulling Julian away from the control interface where he'd been working frantically on the shutdown sequence. "But the glyphs. I need to complete the... Sully's got it handled." I cut him off, dragging him toward the back of the submersible. The reactor was screaming now, a high-pitched whine that made my teeth ache. Through the cockpit, I could see Sully hunched over the controls, blood streaming down his face from where the energy blast had caught him. His hands moved with practiced precision despite his injuries, adjusting settings and monitoring readouts. The rear bay of the Acheron housed our emergency equipment, survival suits, backup oxygen, and most importantly, the single-person escape pod mounted in the launch tube. It wasn't much to look at. Basically a reinforced sphere with life support and a tiny viewport. But it was rated for deep ocean pressure and had enough power to reach the surface. Julian stumbled as we reached the bay, his helmet light sweeping across the cramped space. "Kay, I can't leave Sully behind. And the shutdown sequence. Someone has to survive to warn people about what Xenocorp almost did," I said, popping the pod's hatch. The interior was barely large enough for one person, lined with emergency supplies and a basic control panel. Someone has to tell the world what really happened down here. Behind us, the sound of approaching wardens grew louder. Their energy scalpels hummed with deadly intent, and I could hear them cutting through the bulkheads between us and them. We had maybe 30 seconds before they reached the bay. "Get in," I ordered, pushing Julian toward the pod. He resisted, his face pale behind his helmet visor. "What about you?" I didn't answer. Instead, I shoved him hard, sending him tumbling into the pod's cramped interior. His tablet clattered against the hull as he tried to right himself. "Kay, no!" I slammed the hatch shut and spun the manual lock. Through the small porthole, Julian's eyes went wide with understanding. He pressed his hands against the glass, shouting something I couldn't hear through the sealed hull. The launch mechanism should have been automatic, but the earlier battle had damaged the control systems. Sparks flew from the launch tube's control panel when I tried to activate it. The wardens were almost through the bulkhead now. I could see the glow of their cutting tools through the metal. I grabbed the manual release lever and threw my full weight against it. Nothing happened. The mechanism was jammed, probably from the temple's energy discharges. Julian was pounding on the pod's hatch from the inside, his face desperate. The first warden broke through the bulkhead just as I found the emergency override. It was a simple mechanical system. Pull the pin, and compressed air would fire the pod up through the launch tube. The warden raised its surgical arm, energy crackling along the blade. I yanked the pin. The compressed air system engaged with a violent hiss, and Julian's pod shot upward through the launch tube like a bullet from a gun. The warden's energy scalpel sliced through the air where I'd been standing a split second before, cutting deep gouges in my protective suit. The material parted like paper, and I felt the temple's strange atmosphere seeping in through the tears. More wardens poured into the bay, their optical sensors tracking my movement. I rolled behind a storage locker as energy blasts scorched the walls around me. Through the chaos, I could hear Sully's voice over the comm, counting down the final seconds until reactor overload. 30 seconds to critical mass. His voice was weak but steady. 29. 28. Above us, Julian's pod was racing through what looked like a vertical shaft I hadn't noticed before. The temple's architecture was revealing new passages as it reconfigured itself, creating an escape route that led straight up toward the ocean surface. Through the pod's tiny viewport, Julian would be watching the Acheron grow smaller below him, carrying the truth about humanity's closest brush with extinction. The wardens closed in around me, their energy scalpels humming. I had no ammunition left, no charges, nothing but the knowledge that Julian was safe and climbing toward the surface with evidence of what Xenocorp had really sent us to do. 15 seconds, Sully's voice crackled through the comm. 14, 13. The quantum reactor reached critical mass with a sound like reality tearing apart. The brilliant white flash that followed turned the entire chamber into a miniature sun for one impossible moment. The chain reaction tore through the temple's power core, and I felt the ancient machine beginning to collapse in on itself. The terraforming countdown stopped. The energy that had been building toward atmospheric conversion suddenly had nowhere to go. The crystalline core imploded with silent, devastating force, sending shockwaves through the ocean floor that I felt in my bones. The temple's walls buckled and twisted as the structure folded in on itself, taking the wardens, the Acheron, and everything else with it into a crushing singularity. Far above, Julian's pod continued its long ascent through the crushing darkness, carrying the only record of what had happened in the depths. The truth about the world seed, about Xenocorp's real mission, about how close we'd come to losing everything. It was all in his hands now, racing toward a surface he might never reach.